Hello and welcome to the Blender Cookie Parkour Animation course. In this series of tutorials I'm going to take you through doing a physical based animation based on the theme of parkour. If you haven't heard of parkour before, it's also called free running. If you enter either of those terms into a search engine, you should get a bunch of videos where you'll see people doing very spectacular moves, jumping around urban settings generally, like from the roofs of buildings and around parking garages and that sort of thing. They look spectacular, probably very dangerous to do in real life, but very fun to animate in Blender. So, as you probably have noticed, we're not in Blender. I'm starting out in a paint program, and I really have to emphasize this point, planning is one of the most important parts of animation. The time you put into planning can really save you much more time in Blender later on. Just come up with an idea of what you're going to be doing before you even set a keyframe, and you can work out a lot of things and save a lot of time. So let's have a look at the plan I've come up with. I've got this character who's going to run along this roof and jump across the alley onto this fire escape. And then from there he's going to continue on down onto this window ledge. And from there he will proceed back onto the lower fire escape. So this is a move I've seen after watching a few of these videos online of actual parkour moves, so this is something that I've seen a few people do. But from here he's going to drop down onto this canvas shelter, which he's going to use as a trampoline to propel himself over to this pole, which he's going to swing around up into the air before coming down to land on the ground. And just as a extra thing at the bottom, I have this idea that it's going to be wet cement that he lands in. So he's going to go from looking all spectacular and grand to looking like a bit humiliated. So hopefully that should be a fun shot to animate. And because I've done it all in a paint program with layers, I can actually export it all out as the startings of what's called an animatic, which is exactly what I've done. So I've got a bunch of frames now that I can start importing into Blender. So let's go over to Blender. So I'm just adding images one at a time. The reason I'm doing it one at a time is that I don't want them to all come in as a sequence, because even at this early stage I'm actually going to start dealing with the timing of the animation. Now I'm working at 24 frames a second, and you can see the pacing of that is too slow. So I'm actually going to just start tweaking it now. Yeah, and I'll just do this as I go. It's rather quick, but it'll help me out figuring out the duration of my shot for a start, but also just a general sketch of when things happen on the timeline. The technique I'm using, I'm just leaving this clip that I've just inserted selected, and I just grab this other handle, and it just makes it easy to quickly trim it back. Of course, you can also do the same thing and just press Shift S, and it'll snap to the frame that you're on. So let's so very rough timing. I'm not going to hold to this exactly, but I think it does give me just a realistic idea of when things happen, how long to expect the shot to last. So the final one, I think, bring that back. Yeah, on the ground. Now, in previous animation tutorials, I've really stressed the usefulness of shooting reference of yourself, trying out different ideas, and generating ideas that you wouldn't get from just playing with a rig or mucking around in your sketch pad. Obviously, in this case, there is no way I'm going to be shooting reference of myself doing this move for various reasons. And so what am I going to do? Well, basically in this case I would generally then just approach it from basic principles, just animate off the top of my head based on weight and what I know about the human body and this character, and that in combination with watching a bunch of videos online of people doing similar moves. So there's a lot of people doing this move that I've seen in various parkour videos, and this around the pole, I think I'll probably look at a bunch of gymnastics performances, and around the parallel bars and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to do, a combination of animating off the top of my head and also just looking at reference video. However, at this end section where he lands on the ground, and as I said, he's going to land in wet cement, this is where I need some acting. I need him to react to the fact that he's landed on wet cement, and obviously a change of mood. So this is where I can actually shoot some reference, and I've gone and done that. I'm just going to import them into a separate timeline. So I'm made a new copy of this workspace. I'm making a new scene, copying the settings across. So this gives me a new timeline that I can just use as a reference footage, library, I guess. And just import the movies. Now, because there's no dialogue or anything, I can just get rid of this audio. All the aqua strips are just audio, and I'll just, there we go. Now, this is me attempting various, it's a little bit embarrassing actually. My facial expressions get more and more ridiculous, but I've tried a few different ideas. Now, normally, obviously, the reference doesn't get seen by the public, so I encourage you, if you're shooting reference of yourself, to be as ridiculous as possible and just try out a bunch of ideas and don't be embarrassed, because hopefully you're not going to do what I'm going to do and show it to the public. But anyway, it's a good way of generating ideas, and in the end, this is the pose that I chose. I think this is the one I'm going to use, and in terms of timing, I think this one here is the one I like. That look up is what I'm after. So I'm going to just duplicate that clip and get to the end. Somewhere like that. Now I can just copy that, Control C, and just going back to my video editing, my main timeline, I can just insert that by Control V and Shift S, of course, to snap it. Yeah. So I think in terms of duration, we're probably looking at like 220 frames. So that was all rather quick. You can see I've just very rapidly gotten a timeline together, including some reference footage. And so now I've got a fair idea to get into my layout. Now, one note about these layout sketches. In other shots, normally what you would do is actually include camera angles in your layout and in your storyboards. But in this case, because I'm doing it as a handheld shot, I'm actually going to be animating the camera as I go, based on what the character does. So that's why I haven't included any camera angle. I've just done a side-on view. So this timeline should now provide me enough to get on with layout. Now I just need a set and a character. So, based on the initial planning sketch, I've come up with this low poly, very low detail model of the set. This is what I call the layout set. This is what I'll be using to animate with, and it's what I'll be using as a template to produce the more high detailed set that will end up in the final render. But at this stage, the important points I have to get right are the basic proportions of the set, make sure I can actually get a good camera angle and cover all the action, and also lock down the places at which the character is going to interact with the set. So obviously I don't want that rail to move after I've already started animating it, otherwise I can lose a lot of time in the long run. So it's very important at this stage to get little details like that right. So what I've done, just as I've modeled this set, is I've pulled in the character, and I won't go into too much detail about him right now. I just pulled him in without any rig, just moving him around the set like an action figure, just making sure that the proportions are right and that he's actually able to pull off some of these moves that I've got planned. So the scale I'm using is 1 unit equals 1 meter, which seems to be a bit of a standard. Yeah, and just basically just checking that this model is going to work. And the other thing I do is look at it through a camera perspective. So just looking around, making sure I can get some good composition and cover the action and have it looking, you know, nice and spectacular. And actually it really informed me as I was modeling this to look through the camera, because basically if you can look at the initial planning sketch, the two buildings were actually closer together previously. But by looking at it through a camera, I realized it was going to be very hard to get some good compositions there with a narrow alleyway. All the action was just focused in the center of the screen, and it was hard to get, you know, good dynamic compositions. So I just widened the alleyway, pulled the buildings apart, and now I think I've got something I can actually work with. And that was just all something I found out from moving my my character around the set and just testing out a few camera angles. So that's a tip for when you're making your layout set. So the other tip I can give you is I've added a few lights. Now this might seem a little strange to do in the modeling phase, but it actually also helps with the whole, you know, composition and that sort of thing, just to figure out, is it possible to light this set? Is it possible to catch all the action and still come up with a nice, you know, composition? So you can preview the lights by switching on GLSL in the shading and going over to the texture mode. This is under Blender Render, and you can see just a basic preview of the lighting. And it just also will inform me in the long run of, you know, what sort of parts of the set will I need to model in detail, because clearly some of them will be in shadow and you don't really need that much geometry in there. So yeah, that's another tip I can offer, is just muck around with lighting. This doesn't have to be the final lighting, but it can just give you an idea and help figure out if it's possible to light this set properly and have the action still look good. So that's the basic set. And going back to wireframe, if I just get back to this very stripped down model that only has the key features, I can now produce a group by pressing Ctrl G. I'm adding these to a new group, which I'm going to name set.layout. So that is now a group that I can link into another file and replace it with the final set later on. But for now, this is just going to stand in as a proxy and I can get animating. So it's probably a good time now to introduce you to the character. So it's time to meet Clive. Now, those of you who've already watched the Animation Fundamentals series from CG Cookie will recognize Clive. This is the same character, just an updated version of that same rig. Clive is a basic biped character with a very simple rudimentary face and a simple set of hands. He's designed for learning physical animation and body mechanics. So the rig itself is based on the Rigify biped. Rigify is an add-on that comes with Blender, written by Nathan Vegdal. Provides a nice set of rigs that you can use quite easily, but you don't have to know about Rigify or even have it installed in order to use Clive. It just presents a simple set of controls, a basic set of controls that many of you will already be familiar with, even if you didn't use the previous version. So since I did the last version of Clive, there's been a few changes to the Rigify biped, and I wanted to incorporate those in the new rig, plus add a few tweaks of my own. One thing you might notice is over here on the layers panel, there's a few extra controllers. Several of these are just relocations. I've just grabbed the controllers from other parts of Blender's interface and put them here just for convenience, and there's a couple of extras as well, so I'll just go through them. Firstly, I've got the auto key. You normally find that over here on the timeline, and yet switching it on just means you're automatically keying, but I just find it's easier if you've got the dope sheet open or something like that and timeline not visible, just to have it there, just convenience. Same with the new interpolation type. This is basically determining what sort of curve to write as you animate, and you've got a few options there, and this is normally over here in the user preferences under editing, but once again I just find it easier, more convenient to have it here. Below that I've got a selector for the resolution of the rig. of the mesh actually. It determines, well, you can see as I dial it up, suddenly it gets a lot more detailed, more smooth, but that will, as you would expect, be at the expense of frame rate. So when I'm animating, I'll have that dialed down to 0, and sure, it's a little bit blocky, but at least I'm getting 24 frames a second. Next to that, I've got the mask selector. Now, because Clive is designed specifically for learning animation, it can be handy for a student when you're doing a walk cycle or a run or actually any physical shot, just to be able to focus on the spine, and the arms can be distracting. So I just included the option that you can just mask out those arms, so you can just focus on what's happening in the upper body. And also you can take it a step further and just focus on the hips and the legs and not have the distraction of the upper body. Now below that, I've got the hide all controllers checkbox, which is fairly obvious. It's just a relocation of the only render checkbox that you find under display. But once again, I just can leave display hidden and just have access here. So below that, it's just the standard layers controls for hiding and unhiding the different levels of the rig controllers. Now, one thing I wanted to point out was this new feature in Rigify. Well, it's new since the last version of Clive anyway, and that is the tweakers for the arm. You can see straight away what I'm doing here. This is a really great tool for just tweaking the shape of the arm. You can do really subtle adjustments, or obviously you can go very cartoony if you want. But this is great. It really works well with both FK and IK, and we've got it available on the arms and the legs. Apart from that, it's pretty much a standard Rigify biped. He's only got like one thumb and one finger, and then the rest of the fingers are joined together in a mitt, and so that's one slight change. But apart from that, it is a standard Rigify rig. Now, one thing I wanted to point out, and this is based on a lot of feedback I've had from previous rigs, when you are using these sorts of rigs that involve Python scripts in their drivers and in various parts just to make the rig work, you need to open them in a special way. Basically, if you file open Clive and you don't have trusted source selected, then it will not work. So always make sure you load Clive as a trusted source. Now you can actually sort this out in the user preferences under File. You can say Auto Execution and select Auto Run Python Scripts. Just for security, you can add extra excluded paths, so anything in home free downloads won't run these Python scripts. That's for things, if I've just downloaded it from the web, I don't want to necessarily auto run the Python script. I want to have control over that. So I would just recommend doing that and adding in an exclude directory for your quarantine files. I just had to point that out. Just for anyone using these rigs, you must run the Python scripts as well. So that is the Clive rig. Now it's time to start using him, doing some layout. In my animation file, I'm now ready to switch over to the 3D view and import some assets. Firstly, I'm going to just remove these default objects, and then I'll link in my set. Just a quick note on folder structure. You'll notice I'm using one, even though this is a very simple shot. It's got one character, one set, and I'm the only one working on it. I'm still separating things out into separate blend files rather than doing everything in the one blend file. I like to keep my modeling, rigging, and animation data separate. It just helps out for version control, for finding and fixing bugs, and just general organization. So even though it's so simple, I'm still using this library linking system with Blender. So let's find that set. In the group, we've got set layout. Now it comes in at the point where the 3D cursor is sitting. So you'll see the 3D cursor is sitting at this point, and that's where my group is. Now I always want my group at 0, so Alt-G will clear that. And in fact, just so that the next one comes in at the right point, I'm going to snap the cursor to selected, so make sure it's back at 0. And the reason for this is that I want all of my location data, all of the placement of objects and stuff to be either recorded in the original file, so I want to have the placement of this building in the original files, and not in the animation file. Or in the case of character, I want all the movement to be recorded only in the rig, not in the position of the group. So for that reason, I always have my groups at 0, 0, 0. Just makes it a lot easier in the long run. So let's import Clive. And he's back at 0. Now, with the Clive, with the Clive linked group, you'll notice that there's actually no mesh data over here on the tabs. That's because a linked group, it's not really an object that you can edit. There's not much you can edit about a linked group when you bring it in. So in order to animate Clive, we're going to have to make a proxy of his armature. And what that does is makes a local copy of the armature that we can actually animate. And that's easy to do. It's just Control-Alt-P, and I select Clive.rig, and there we go, there's the armature. So you might notice that we don't have a Clive layers panel. That's because the final step in this process is I have to link in the Python script, and that is found in the same file under text rigui.py, and it doesn't appear straight away. That's because the script doesn't get auto run straight away. Next time I open this file, it will appear, but this first time I link it in, I actually have to manually run the script. So run the script, and back to the 3D view, and now we have Clive layers. So we're just about ready to go. I just wanted to have a little extra note about folder structure. You might have noticed as I was looking around the folders before that I had these little folders called back. That's where I save copies. This is my way of backing up different versions of the file. So if let's save a copy, and I just press the plus button on the keypad until it stops being read, basically until I find the next number, and I've saved my backup. And that way at the end of the project I can just do a search for back folders, delete all of them because I don't need them at the end of the project, and I can just back up my project. But as I'm working, it means I've always got copies I can go back to. If there's something that goes wrong, something gets corrupted, or I really mess something up, I've always got my previous versions to go back to. So let's add a camera. You might have noticed when I was describing the set before that I was actually using a special camera rig. That's actually provided by an add-on. It's called the Add Camera Rigs add-on, and it's written by Wayne Dixon and Chris Whittick. It doesn't come standard with Blender, so you'll have to download this separately. I think it might be included in Trunk in the future, but for now you'll find it on the Blender wiki. You can just do a search for Blender camera add-on, and you should find this. But very handy. It basically adds extra entries when you try to add an armature. You've got two extra entries now, dolly camera rig and crane camera rig. I'm going to use the dolly camera rig because it's most similar to a cameraman standing on the ground. And you can see what happens. We've actually got a camera rig that's appeared, and if I go into pose mode, I've now got a cameraman with a root controller, much like you'll have on Clive, and then the position of the camera and the target of the camera. So it makes it nice and easy for this sort of work. So we're in pose mode on both. I might save a copy, and we're ready to commence layout.